you. In recent years, things have not looked good for so-called free will. Based on neurophysiological facts, its existence has been denied, or in other words, it has been denied that we ever are in the full and proper sense originators of our own physical actions. In this paper, I propose to show that the scientific, quantum physical, and evolution biological facts do not offer a sufficient reason for a denial of free will. On the contrary, those facts strongly suggest that we and other higher animals do at least sometimes act in the full and proper sense in the realm of the physical. That is, they strongly suggest that we make genuine, hence also truly decisive decisions between alternatives of being, between ways for the physical world to be. We have something to decide and we exist for deciding something. I begin with a fundamentally important distinction. Physical indeterminism and the resolution of physical indeterminism are two different things. Physical indeterminism is given at a time t if and only if, beginning with time t, there are the completed physical past up to t notwithstanding several physically possible further courses of the physical world, at least two, if not more. That physical indeterminism occurs at some times, perhaps at all times, is today a widely accepted lesson from quantum physics. This lesson is not a necessary or logical consequence of quantum physics. It is certainly a matter of its interpretation. Of an interpretation of quantum physics, however, which is natural and plausible and which has prevailed almost completely against Einsteinian dreams of a restoration of physical determinism and against the Bohmian alternative interpretation which safeguards the old determinism. In what follows, I presuppose the existence of physical indeterminism. Now, resolution of physical indeterminism always occurs when physical indeterminism occurs. For always, the physical world continues in a determinate way. Always, the physical indeterminacy is replaced by determinacy. There are exactly two possible ways of a resolution of physical indeterminism. Firstly, by ontic chance, hence without any sufficient cause, but just like that. Secondly, by a sufficient non-physical cause. Let us take note. The existence of physical indeterminism does not logically entail the existence of ontic chance in the physical world. For physical indeterminism and the resolution of physical indeterminism are, on the one hand, two different things. And on the other hand, the resolution of physical indeterminism need not always, or even sometimes, come about by ontic chance. It is not a logical consequence of quantum physics that physical indeterminism occurs. It is, even more emphatically, not a logical consequence of it that the resolution of physical indeterminism always occurs via ontic chance. This latter consequence follows only if one adds a principle to quantum physics, which is not a principle of physics, but of a specific kind of metaphysics, the principle of the causal closure of the physical world, which principle says that every physical event that has a sufficient cause at all also has a sufficient physical cause. Assume there is physical indeterminism at t. Hence, beginning with time t, There are several physically possible further courses of the physical world, the entirety of the physical past up to t notwithstanding. Precisely one of these further courses becomes actual. How does this come about? Prima facie, the answer is unclear. What is clear, however, is this. In whichever way the resolution of physical indeterminism at hand comes about, there is, in any case, a physical event beginning with time t, which has no sufficient physical cause, since even the entire physical past up to t is not a sufficient physical cause of it. On the basis of the principle of the causal closure of the physical world, it follows for such an event that it has no sufficient cause at all. Hence, that it happens by ontic chance. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on one's metaphysical point of view, this conclusion is by no means indisputable. For if, instead of the principle of causal closure of the physical world, one assumes the principle of sufficient cause, every event has a sufficient cause, as a metaphysical addition to quantum physics, then it follows that the event in question, the event beginning with time t, which has no sufficient physical cause, does have a sufficient cause, but a non-physical one. The principle of the causal closure of the physical world has no greater right to be believed in than the principle of sufficient cause, neither systematically nor historically. On the contrary, the principle of sufficient cause is metaphysically more neutral, hence in a certain sense more rational than the closure principle. Not long ago, the principle of sufficient cause still enjoyed the dignity of a quasi-logical principle. And historically, it is, of course, by far the more respected postulate. Mainly one thing speaks for the principle of the causal closure of the physical world, and it is not a rational reason. Those who believe in it fear non-physical causes of physical events like the plague. They even fear a non-physical influence on the physical. Even theologians nowadays fear a causality of the non-physical that touches the physical world, which I find a rather curious phenomenon. The principle of sufficient cause requires that the resolution of physical indeterminism always occur by a non-physical sufficient cause. The principle of the causal closure of the physical world requires that this resolution always be by ontic chance, without sufficient cause. In what follows, I proceed on the assumption that some, even many, resolutions of physical indeterminism occur by non-physical causes. In doing so, I position myself against the principle of causal closure, consider it false, without, however, wishing to wholly exclude ontic chance as a means of the resolution of physical indeterminism. The principle of sufficient cause, too, may be false. What is the import of all this for the agency of natural living beings? The agency of natural living beings is their agency in the physical macro world. The presupposition for the existence of such agency is not only the existence of physical indeterminism simpliciter, but the existence of physical indeterminism in the physical macro world. Moreover, of such an indeterminism as is detectable by natural living beings. Only if there are indeterministic situations of possibility in the physical macro world that are detectable by natural living beings, only then can a natural living being contribute to their resolution. For example, in order to gain a biological advantage. In this precisely does the agency of natural living beings consist, in contributing to the resolution, the ontic deciding of indeterministic macrophysical situations of possibility, normally with the aim of gaining a biological advantage. What are the indications that there are indeterministic situations of possibility in the physical macro world which are detectable by natural living beings? In other words, that for some times t, the following is true. There are several physically possible further causes of the physical macro world beginning with t in such a manner that this situation can be found out by a natural living being. One indication is that the physical macro world strikes us, and probably not only us human beings, as being to a considerable extent contingent. In every second of our waking life, we have, looking back at the past of the physical macro world, the consciousness that things could have been otherwise than they were, that we, in particular, could have acted differently than we did. Looking ahead at the future of the physical macro world, we have the consciousness of being able to act like this or otherwise. That, more generally speaking, things can be like this in the future or otherwise. Those who assume determinism for the physical macro world must consider the apparent contingency of the physical macro world as one gigantic continuing illusion, an illusion which cannot be eliminated, which can only be uncovered. But how plausible really is this? Why the consciousness of contingency? Why even consciousness at all if the physical macro world is ruled by determinism? If it is ruled by determinism, consciousness is pure luxury, extravagancy. Sometimes it happens that biological evolution treats itself to a luxury, but not a luxury which has such a high price. The large amount of energy that the central nervous system consumes in the production of consciousness, including the insistent, imperturbable consciousness of contingency. Another indication of the existence of indeterministic situations of possibility in the physical macro world is this. There seem to exist in the physical macro world goings-on that can be correctly described as competition, struggle, fight. Who believes in determinism in the physical macro world must, however, deny the existence of such goings-on. For a determinist, true fights cannot exist. Two soccer teams, it is said, fight for victory. Not so. If determinism rules in the physical macro world, then who will win is determined even before the two teams begin to play. And rightly considered, the verb to win must here be put in scare quotes. Two males, it is said, fight over a female. Not so. If determinism rules in the physical macro world, then what happens in this case is, as in the case of the soccer game, only the masquerade of a fight, only the masquerade of a competition. Everything is already determined. Everything has been decided beforehand. Nothing is open anymore. If indeed it is the case that determinism rules in the physical macro world. There are only rigged games then, and also the serious game of life, the so-called struggle for existence, is a rigged game then, not a true struggle, but a bad, indeed evil joke, since for the antagonists in that game, it feels exactly as if it weren't rigged, exactly as if it were an open struggle and they were fighting, really fighting for a good outcome for themselves. It is not only morality which is rendered absurd by determinism in the physical macro world, it is biology too. And by the way, philosophy as well. For what is the point in discussing anything at all if all our voiced opinions, whichever they may be, were already determined to be voiced by us even before we began to exist? And there is nothing else and this is nothing else than a reductio ad absurdum of physical macro-determinism, albeit, as we all know, not a generally accepted reductio. Indeterminism in the physical micro-world, and hence also, as a logical consequence, physical indeterminism simpliciter, do indeed enjoy widespread credence due to the almost general acceptance of quantum physics. But indeterminism in the physical macro world is widely rejected. Regarding the physical macro world, determinism of the Newtonian and Laplacian stamp is still widely accepted. The usual reason given for this is this: microphysical indeterminism cannot play any macrophysical role, cannot magnify itself into the macrophysical realm because of the massive and unavoidable disturbances coming from the natural environment. It is therefore for many people as if there were two physical worlds, one microphysical in which indeterministic situations of possibility occur, as can be found out by complicated procedures, and one macrophysical in which no indeterministic situations of possibility occur, in which, in any case, none, it is said, are scientifically detectable. Indeed, this is the position which is nowadays almost invariably assumed by one of the metaphysically interested side, by scientists and philosophers who have a materialist, naturalistic metaphysical orientation. But let us ask, how would an indeterministic situation of possibility in the physical macro world be scientifically detected? It would have to be detected after it is already over, after it has already been resolved, by proving, by ascertaining beyond scientific doubt that a certain physical macro event has no sufficient physical cause. Now, one in fact encounters physical macro events in huge amounts, which do not seem to have a sufficient physical cause. Chaotic goings-on of the most various kinds, so-called chance processes, among them the familiar die throws and coin throws with their concluding events that serve for the purposes of everyday life as chance events. But the step from seems not to have a sufficient physical cause to does not have a sufficient physical cause is usually not taken, because it is supposed a priori that there must be a sufficient physical cause, although none is apparent. For proving scientifically that there are physical macro events without sufficient physical cause, there is therefore from the start a very large problem. From the start, quite unscientifically, such events are not given a fair chance of existing. But they should be given a chance. Is it not to be expected that a large microphysical indeterminism, one that involves large numbers of elementary particles, will issue into a macrophysical indeterminism? Is it not to be expected that on intricate and involved paths, even a small microphysical indeterminism will lead to a macrophysical one? We are not dealing with two physical worlds. We are dealing with only one. And this one physical world is ruled by the laws of quantum physics, not by those of 19th century physics. Brain scientists like to emphasize that brain processes obey without exception the laws of physics. This is of course true, for brain processes are physical processes. But the laws they obey are the laws of quantum physics, not the laws of the old deterministic physics. Therefore, also in the brain, it is to be reckoned with physically spontaneous events, with physical events without sufficient physical cause. And such events as brain processes, not already as processes in the brain, would be physical macro events, would still be physical macro events. Physically spontaneous physical macro events in the brain would, however, be the unmistakable indicators of the occurrence of brain-centered macrophysical indeterministic situations of possibility. Some time ago, the result of the so-called Libet experiment produced considerable perturbations. The readiness potential for a physical action, which is given in the brain already some time before one is conscious of deciding to do the deed, was regarded by some as a refutation of free will. Look here, they rejoiced. The verb to rejoice is not as inappropriate as it may seem at first sight. Before you believe that you are deciding, the brain has already decided. You didn't decide anything, or in any case, you did not genuinely decide anything. For your decision coming too late was in any case not the truly decisive one. What came comparatively seldom into the focus of attention was the question of what had produced the readiness potential in the first place. So much was one used to considering the brain a deterministic automaton that hardly anybody, perhaps nobody, I don't know, considered the possibility that the brain processes in which the readiness potential consists are physically spontaneous processes. That is, physical events without sufficient physical cause. One has not excluded this possibility, and I, for one, wouldn't know how it could be excluded. If the brain processes in question are in fact physical events without sufficient physical cause, then there are, concerning their being caused or not, only two basic options. Either they do not have any sufficient cause, or they do have a non-physical sufficient cause. In both cases, the occurrence of brain-centered macrophysical indeterministic situation in both cases, the occurrence of a brain-centered macrophysical indeterministic situation of possibility is indicated. As long as physics remains pure science, none of the two options is excluded by it. Physics, as long as it stays free of metaphysics, gives both ontic chance and non-physical causality a chance. Generally, and with respect to brain processes. Non-physical causality, however, is what must interest us here when considering agency. For agency is not a matter of chance. Let us pursue a hypothesis, or rather a network of hypotheses. The waking subject of consciousness of a natural living being endowed with consciousness is at the same time the subject of physical action of that living being. Consciousness, among other things it offers in the line of service, points out to the waking subject, directly in perception, macrophysical indeterministic situations of possibility, especially such on whose resolution the subject can exercise an influence. Moreover, consciousness proposes to the waking subject guidelines for the exercise of its influence, in case that influence is actually exercised. Emotions and sensations, conscious needs and drives. But these guidelines, even when taken together, are at least sometimes non-determinative. The subject remains at least sometimes, up to a certain degree, the sovereign of its physical actions. If it were not so, subjects of consciousness and physical action would be biological superfluities. A subject of consciousness and physical action that belongs to a natural living being is so far from being a biological superfluity that it is a non-physical organ of its organism. An organ which serves, like every organ of the organism's life, especially its preservation. Consider what happens if this non-physical organ goes temporarily out of service, or at least does not fulfill its task to a considerable extent. The organism is rendered less protected or entirely unprotected. The service, then, of a subject of consciousness and physical action for the life of its organism consists in this. To the advantage of its organism, it contributes to the resolution of some of the macrophysical indeterministic situations it detects, and on the resolution of which it can exercise an influence. The agency of a subject of consciousness and physical action is precisely the restriction of macrophysical indeterminism. Consider that every macrophysical indeterministic situation consists in a set of several possibilities. The physically possible further courses of the macrophysical world beginning with a time t. From some such sets, a subject of consciousness and physical action selects a non-empty proper subset. And if a subject of consciousness and physical action resolves a macrophysical indeterministic situation already all by itself, which doubtless comes about rather rarely, if at all, among the subjects of consciousness and physical action which belong to natural living beings. I repeat, and if a subject of consciousness and physical action resolves a macrophysical indeterministic situation already all by itself, then it is precisely a singleton set which the subject selects from the pool of possibilities. In any case, the subject of consciousness and physical action exercises an influence, a greater or smaller one. Its choice is ontically effective, and it is not a blind choice. The subject of consciousness and physical action chooses in the light of its consciousness, in the light of its outer and inner perceptions, in the light of its guidelines of willing, in the light of its rational considerations, if they are such. Often its choice is, nevertheless, to a certain degree arbitrary, sometimes entirely arbitrary. But arbitrariness does not turn choice into ontic chance. Ontic chance and choice exclude each other, even if the choosing is arbitrary. If it is choice, someone is choosing. If it is ontic chance, nobody is choosing. And if choice is completely non-arbitrary, because consciousness indicates what is best, without ambiguity, and the subject of consciousness and physical action unhesitatingly follows this indication, then choice is still not turned into determination by this. Determination too and choice exclude each other. If it is choice, someone is choosing. If it is determination, nobody is choosing, for under determination, nobody has a choice. The agency of the subject of consciousness and physical action for the organism does not take place beside or behind the organism. It is not as if such a subject were a sort of guardian angel for the organism. Rather, the subject of consciousness and physical action emerges together with its consciousness from the nervous system of the organism, mainly from the brain. And it is in its existence and in many details of its existence, nomologically bound by the laws of nature to neuronal functions. It is, however, not determined by the nervous system in every respect, for that would mean that it is an epiphenomenon of the neuronal and hence a biological superfluity. But nature is not fond of superfluities. Rather, the subject of consciousness and physical action is a highly useful for the organism, a highly useful detector of macroscopic indetermination, and restrictor. In short, a Domindar. This is the acronym for that. The true relationship between the organism's subject of consciousness and physical action, the Domindar, and the organism's nervous system can be illustrated cum grano salis, as always, by an analogy. A pianist is not able to play the piano without a piano. And if she plays the piano, then much in her playing is determined by the piano she plays on. But not everything in the pianist's piano playing is determined by the piano played on. Not which musical pieces the pianist plays, and not which interpretation she accords to them. Also not how well the pianist plays, insofar as this is up to her. The piano is a necessary instrument of the pianist qua pianist. The nervous system, with the brain at its center, is a necessary instrument of the Domindar qua Domindar. Without their respective instruments, they cannot, for necessary compelling reasons, do what is their calling. However, this leaves entirely undiminished the fact that the pianist cannot be reduced to a piano, and that the Domindar is irreducible to a nervous system. At one point especially, this analogy is not perfect. A pianist is not a product, let alone a non-physical product, of the instrument she plays on, whereas a Domindar is indeed a non-physical product of what the Domindar subsequently plays on, so to speak. The relationship between Domindar and nervous system is much closer than the relationship between pianist and piano. So close that the nervous system, especially the brain, can well be called an instrumental Domindar. How does this instrument function? At bottom, it functions in a way not fundamentally different from the way a piano functions. The pianist reads the musical score, and on the basis of this cognizance, she presses selectively the piano keys as she wishes and thinks fit. The internal mechanics of the piano, in turn, translates the resulting patterns of key pressings into the sequences of sounds intended by the pianist. Analogously, the subject of consciousness and physical action reads in its consciousness, and on the basis of this cognizance, it contributes by informed choice to the resolution of certain macrophysical indeterministic situations detected by it. The internal mechanics of the nervous system, in turn, translates the resulting physically spontaneous brain processes into the subject-intended extra-neuronal restrictions of precisely the detected macrophysical indeterministic situation. A macrophysical indeterministic situation of possibility has, in its relation to a cerebrated natural living being, which can do something about it, a cerebral, a neuronal, and an extra-neuronal aspect. The contribution of the living being subject of consciousness and physical action to the resolution of that situation has likewise a cerebral, a neuronal, and an extra-neuronal aspect. The cerebral aspect, the physically causeless brain event caused by the non-physical subject of consciousness and physical action, is properly the subject's own causal influence. The rest is projection into the larger externality via neuronal and muscular electrochemistry and mechanics. However, what is properly important to that subject of consciousness and physical action is precisely this projection into the larger externality, the extra-neuronal aspect, the bodily movement, whether in flight, fight, or other life-relevant situation. The mechanisms of the causal connection between the cerebral and the extra-neuronal aspect via via the neuronal aspect are nowadays well understood. I need not emphasize how precarious, how endangered this connection is in every cerebrated natural living being, in particular in every human being. I also need not emphasize that it seems mysterious how the non-physical subject of consciousness and physical action, the Domindar, manages to decide a macrophysical indeterministic situation of possibility, at least to such an extent, partially, that a physically spontaneous brain event comes about. A brain event which is not an event of ontic chance, but is caused by the Domindar, and truly decisively caused by the Domindar, that is, without superfluity of the Domindar's causality. This seems mysterious to everybody. It should be noted, however, that there's little rationality in seeking to turn the mysteriousness of the agency of the subject of consciousness and physical action into a rope, so to speak, wherewith to strangle it philosophically. Generally speaking, the mysteriousness of the state of affairs that X does F, even if it is a great mysteriousness, does not entail that the state of affairs that X does F does not obtain, let alone does it entail that X itself does not exist. There is, moreover, simply no question about the existence of subjects of consciousness and physical actions and about the existence of their agency. We are subjects of consciousness and physical actions ourselves, and we act physically with our brains, with our organism. There's only a question about the initial or first agency of a subject of consciousness and physical action. How does that agency come about? Counter question: must every instance of causality have a specifiable way in which it functions? The answer is, not every instance of causality can have a specifiable way in which it functions. The situation is as follows. If the causality is mediate, then a way in which it functions can, in principle, be pointed out. This can be done via analyzing the causality in question into several causal steps. But this procedure comes inevitably to an end. With practical necessity, we must stop the procedure at some point after a finite number of rounds, and it ends unavoidably with something which is functionally still not understood: the causal connection between steps n and n plus 1. If, however, the causality is immediate, if it is without intermediate mediating causes, then the situation is as follows. An analysis into causal steps cannot be given, not even in principle. One cannot point to any proper more than two-membered causal chains. One is confronted from the start with something which cannot be functionally understood. Now, the causality in which a non-physical subject of consciousness and physical action causes brain events which have no sufficient physical cause, this causality is a purely immediate one, as such also a purely first causal one, as can be shown. This much, at least, can be perfectly understood about purely immediate causality. But there is nothing explanatory to be said about how it works, how it functioned, what is its mechanism. It is the expression of a choice. That's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Meixner. I now invite to the front Dr. Johannes Grössl from the University of Siegen for a response.
Thank you. Uwe Meixner argues in his paper for an understanding of agency as non-physical causation. He discusses the principles of causal closure of the physical world and the principle of sufficient cause, providing reasons to reject both principles. A rejection of the principle of sufficient cause allows ontic indeterminacy. A rejection of the principle of causal closure allows for agency. Determinism, as well as genuine randomness, is, according to Meixner, incompatible with agency. Not all instances of indeterminacy, he claims, are random events. One remark about these principles. As we have seen in discussions yesterday, some people just have a strong intuition that, with equal explanatory power, a deterministic explanation is always better than an explanation that involves random, inexplicable events. But not everyone agrees that the principle of sufficient cause rules out ontic randomness, at least if understood in a Leibnizian way as principle of sufficient reason. Granted, spontaneous random collapse interpretations of quantum mechanics seem to be incompatible with the principle of sufficient reason. But Alexander Proust, for example, describes a theistic way out of the so-called quantum objection to PSR. Quote, "The reason for one rather than another of the possibilities eventuating could be some random indeterministic physical process started by God." Quote end. However, it remains difficult to accept God or built-in randomness generators in the universe as sufficient reasons or explanations. Still, no specific reason can be provided for why the generator produces A and not non-A in a specific resolution of an indeterminacy. That's just the nature of randomness. The second part of Meixner's paper, starting with paragraph 4, is about the relation between quantum indeterminacy and macro-indeterminacy. Some proponents of anti-quantum indeterminacy deny macro-indeterminacy. Because of an effect called decoherence, the macroscopic world appears as it were deterministic. Quantum indeterminacy is usually negligible when calculating the motion of physical objects. Decoherence means that randomness evens out eventually with a predicted future state of a system coming about with a probability almost equal to 1. For example, that all the oxygen molecules in this room move to this side and all the nitrogen molecules move to the other side. That's theoretically possible, not good for this side, but the chance is less than 1 to 10 to the 30th. Fundamental laws, as the second law of thermodynamics, are statistical laws. Long-term developments of systems are, it is claimed, statistically determined. Even if quantum indeterminacy can theoretically play a role in ordinary macroscopic events, in most cases it is quite irrational to believe that in some particular instance it did. The crucial question is whether there are places in the universe where quantum effects become amplified. And the answer here is, I think, quite simple. Yes, there are, at least since the 1920s, when we started to measure the spin of elementary particles and started to shoot particles through the double slit one by one. Providing a macroscopic display of quantum measurement results either implies multiverses, quantum superpositions of macroscopic systems, or quantum amplification. Because of ontological scarcity and in order to maintain epistemological realism, let us assume here that amplification is the correct answer. Roger Penrose, Stuart Hameroff, and John Eccles argue that the brain is a powerful quantum amplification machine. All of the concrete models proposed by them are highly disputed. The framework seems to be the only way non-physical causation can be conceived without rejecting our current understanding of the laws of nature or claiming that they are abrogated by mental interventions. Agency, or more exact, free agency, can best be understood as a macroscopic amplification of a non-physically caused, non-random resolution of quantum indeterminacy. After providing a way of conceiving non-physical causation, can we provide evidence for believing that non-physical causation is occurring at a certain point? Meixner suggests the following. 1. Agency is an illusion unless non-physical causation exists. 2. Consciousness is highly energy-consuming and therefore ruled out as a long-term evolutionary byproduct unless it provides actual evolutionary advantage by enabling additional influence such as non-physical causation. 3. No genuine games or fights occur unless non-physical causation exists. 4. Moral responsibility is impossible unless non-physical causation exists. And 5. Genuine discussions with the belief that others can be convinced by arguments are futile unless we believe that people are not determined to think or believe in an irrational way. The critic or the anti-dualist could respond to these points as follows. 1. Agency is an illusion. Just get used to it. We believe to be free agents if our first and second order wishes coincide. Ultimately, it's the brain that determines our actions. 2. About the highly energy-consuming aspect. Consciousness might be a byproduct, but zombies with a problem-solving ability as high as we have or artificial intelligences on our level would have a similar high level of energy consumption, a similar high level of complexity. Therefore, consciousness might just be a byproduct, or, as the panpsychist might argue, a necessary consequence of proto-mental matter being arranged in a sufficiently complex structure. 3. Games and fights aspect. If I play with a chess master, it's determined I lose, but I still play a game. And maybe I even have a little fun doing that. The same holds for a fight. 4. Moral responsibility might be compatible with determinism, as argued by Harry Frankfurt and John Martin Fisher, who reject the principle of alternate possibilities. This might not be a robust way of understanding morality, but a concept that is sufficient for guaranteeing law and order, punishing and praising people. 5. The retorsion argument. Those who are neurologically wired to think irrationally cannot be convinced with reasons, but only manipulated with rhetorics or their brains be modified. Since rationality often provides evolutionary advantage, we are justified to hope that irrationally dies out eventually. But despite these criticisms, let's assume with Meixner that his arguments, at least in combination, give us good reasons to believe in humans being what he calls Domindars. We experience that not all conceivable actions are in our power. We are all prone to our scope of action being limited by external and internal forces. The latter ones we experience as weakness of will. By growing up, we learn to distinguish what usually is in our power and what is not. We learn to detect macroscopic indetermination, but only over a longer period of time by trial and error. What remains as weakness of will is either the intermediate area in between inaccessible and accessible actions, whose accessibility sometimes depend on factors like the blood sugar level, or inaccessible actions which we falsely believe to be accessible. In his other paper, a little longer, Meixner has admitted that the brain is not only a domindar but a fallible domindar. That's, I think, a good description. I would love to hear Uwe Meixner's thoughts on whether he believes that the experience of weakness of will can count as a further, maybe even a stronger argument for his theory. One last remark. One could argue with Kane or Van Inwagen that the amount of free actions is quite lower than we experience. It is a false dichotomy to say that either we are free and thus non-physical causes of our actions every time we believe that we make or have made a decision, or our having control over our actions is always an illusion. According to restrictive libertarianism, we are free only in rare and special situations, such as in moments of foundational character formation or when choosing between acting in accordance with inclination or obligation. Since moving body parts usually does not result from such a decision, Leibniz-style experiments are absolutely irrelevant for the question whether we possess free will or not. Not only alternative possibilities, but also sourcehood and rationality are necessary conditions of free actions. Together, they constitute a sufficient condition. Accordingly, non-physical causation from the mind to the brain must not be understood as an ongoing process, also not as a gradual phenomenon, but rather as a set of quite rare and thus almost undetectable events. While occasionalists argue that mental events and correspondent neuronal activity is mediated by God, One might prefer the theory that mind-brain interaction laws are built into the fundamental reality that consists of the physical and mental world. In order to engage in a fair and fruitful discussion about the most adequate theory and philosophy of mind, it is quite important to work out dualist theories beyond the discussion levels which recur to pineal glands. Meixner contributes to this through his account of non-physical causation and emergent dualism, the latter of which I think implies some type of pan-proto-psychism, but to discuss this is beyond the limit of this response. Thank you.
Professor Meixner, the word is yours.
I have a hard time of responding to this because I have a hard time of detecting criticism. But let me make some comments about weakness of the will. That you explicitly mentioned that. Weakness of the will occurs in a situation where the do-minder is really free. There are occurrences of weakness of the will where the do-minder is determined and not free. He just has to do the worse alternative, although his consciousness tells him the other alternative is the better one. He really doesn't have an alternative. He has to do the bad thing. But weakness of the will can also occur in situations where he does have an alternative. There are two ways. One is good and one is bad, in whatever way. And his consciousness tells him, or he himself, via his consciousness, tells him that's the better alternative. But nevertheless, he chooses irrationally the worst one. And that's how can this come about? Consciousness provides guidelines for the do-minder, but very often these consciousness is like counselors. There are some counselors on this side, and they tell the subject of consciousness, do that. Or there are counselors on the other side and tell the subject of consciousness, do this other thing, the others are wrong, and so on. And even there could be the position, don't listen to them. That's what you now should have. And then the subject of consciousness freely decides for the bad alternative. I think these ways of weak will are the less frequent ones. The others I mentioned first are the much more common ones where there really is no alternative, and the do-minder can't help what he does. He's forced to do it in view of the better alternative. So that's what I would like to say about this. Perhaps I should make some comments about the initial dialectic of my talk. There's something that comes from quantum physics, but not as a logical consequence, but as a matter of interpretation. This is the existence of physical events which have no sufficient physical cause. And then it depends which way you go. You might say it has no cause at all, or you might say it has a non-physical cause. If you say it has no cause at all, that is a consequence from the principle of causal closure. If you say it has a cause, but a non-physical one, then this is a consequence of the principle of sufficient reason. But it was important to me to say that you don't have to rely on the principle of sufficient reason or sufficient cause for getting non-physical causes. It's just implausible to assume, or I should say it's without any good reason to simply assume that every physical event that has no sufficient physical cause has no cause at all. Why should we assume that? You don't need the principle of sufficient cause for that. By all sympathy I have with that principle, it seems much more rational to me than the principle of causal closure.